Bubble, bubble, toil and trouble. Today we're going to talk with the fantasy creatures known as witches and... Wait, what? Really? I've just been informed. Witches are not fantasy creatures and are in fact people and a modern religion that's actually fairly normal. So... that sucks. I had a whole, there's gonna be a hat and there's gonna be a nose. Oh well, we must stick to the truth. Today, we're gonna talk about witches, or shall I say, Wiccans. The old, young, atheist, pantheist, polytheist religion. Happy Halloween, friends. Or should I say Samhain? So I suppose we should start by trying to figure out what Wicca is. Exactly. As I mentioned, it's a old young religion. Now, it's young because its foundation really is only tracked back to about the 1950s, but it's old in the sense that what they're doing is in large part a recreation or an attempt to be informed by traditions and religious practices and identities that go back to pre-Christian times. It's a neo-pagan movement, probably one of the most recognized ones, which is a movement to reconstruct pre-Christian, pre-Islamic, pre-Abrahamic religions in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Some groups try to, as closely as possible, analyze the past and find the practices and beliefs and try to reconstruct them as acutely as possible. Some, and this is more where Wicca falls, try to take and be informed by religious practices of the past, but very much use it more to inform their spirituality and inform their spiritual practice rather than try to recreate it. Now, there's been lots of attempts to try and classify Wicca under different religious categories. It's obviously a nature-reverent religion. So like Shinto, it's a religion that reveres the natural world and puts a lot of power in nature. It's a mystery religion, which is a religion that has intentional mystique about it, one that you have to be invited into, and that there are rituals and initiations that you need to go further into the church, ones that will not be made apparent to you right away. It's a new age religion, which speaks to the student movement and the baby boomers of the 1970s who tried to break away from their classical understanding of Christian spirituality and try to make something new in their own by taking different religious philosophies and mashing them together. Now, the term Wicca actually comes from ye olde English. It's the olden term for witchcraft, which is better branding because calling yourselves witches might still have a little bit of stigma attached to it. Although there's a big deal about them trying to reclaim witchcraft and the term witch as a way to show solidarity with the oppressed women and the oppressed spiritualities of past ages. It's a reclamation of the long time of European oppression of women and of forms of medicine and things that they did not understand. Also, witches were a term bandied about in order to achieve capitalist enclosure, which is when, took all of the things that were held in common and put fences around it to say, now it's private property and I worked for it somehow now. But that's going to be a, history of capitalism video that I definitely need to make someday. If you want to learn more about this process, I would recommend you watch the Philosophy Tube video on witches, or my video on witches and beer, or Angie Speaks, who made a video about it also this time last year, and she very kindly and on very short notice recorded a little bit for me, so I'm just gonna play it and let her describe what being a witch means to her. While she's not Wiccan, she definitely is in that space.
Reclaiming witchcraft puts you in touch with the lineage of strength and struggle against the forces of coercion and rigidly patriarchal paradigms. Witchcraft to me has always been a reservoir of the knowledge of those who were historically marginalized, and a glimpse into the techniques they used to keep their minds, bodies, and spirits whole in a hostile world. Witchcraft is a path that connects one to the divinity and potency of the earth, and inspires reverence for the energies that unite all living things on the planet. It is not a paradigm that is for everyone, but those who adopt it find spiritual fulfillment and peace at their altars.
Thank you, Angie, and of course you can see all the videos I'm referencing down in the description. So now we should probably move into what it is that Wiccans believe. What is the belief structure of Wicca? And what you'll find very quickly is that they believe lots and lots of things. Wicca is a very decentralized religion. It has no central canonical text. There is the Book of Shadows, but it's not canonical, it's just influential. So Wiccans have a lot of diversity in their belief sets. It's more a religion based around the things you do rather than the things you believe, if that makes sense. As I kind of said at the beginning, Wicca ranges from atheists who see the pagan gods more as Jungian archetypes, get away from me, Jordan Peterson, and pantheists who literally believe everything is God. But let's go back to the origins of Wicca and what they believed mostly. The first Wiccans believed in a duotheism, that there was a male and a female god. The male was a fertility spirit called the Horned God, which is sort of an amalgamation of different horned gods throughout pagan history, and that the female god was the mother goddess, who represents, nature and living things and all that stuff. So you can see there's a lot of Jungian stuff with the duality of gender and all those kinds of things, and it becomes problematic a little bit later. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, the first pagans believed that the knowledge of these gods has been passed down through religious lineage from the Stone Age all the way to now. The founder of the faith, Gerald Gardner, claims that he had been invited into a witch's coven and that he was instructed in the knowledge of these gods and is just passing it down. Now, for a long time, the names of these gods was a close guarded secret, but in 1964, it became public that their names were Cernunnos and Aradia. Their names have since apparently been changed. As you know, Wicca changes a lot and can be slippery. There's also been an influx of monotheism into Wicca. Some people believe very much that there is one god that's sort of over those two gods, and it's sort of this genderless, unknowable entity. And on top of that, there are some that believe that the two gods, the god and the goddess, are like two faces but of one deity, which is sort of an idea that probably was borrowed from the Hindus. But nonetheless, starting in the 1960s, there's a strong monotheistic current within Wicca. There's also an idea of polytheism, where there are multiple gods that are facets of the one god, which is very much like the Hindus. But there's also a polytheistic, just straight up polytheistic Wicca, where there are lots of gods, all the ones you love. And some are also animist, which is like the belief that there is a spirit within all things, kind of like the Shinto. One other really curious thing about Wicca is that it's very present-minded. The idea that you should be focused in the moment and not too worried about the past or the future, which is interesting because it means that Wicca actually doesn't have that much of an emphasis on things that many other religions think is important, like the afterlife. There are Wiccans that don't believe in the afterlife. There are Wiccans that believe in reincarnation. So it's just not a big part of the faith. What is a big part of the faith, though, is magic. I believe in magic. Now, we haven't talked too much about magic on Step Back, and it's a nuanced and complicated subject that's definitely too big for just a subsection of a video. So I'm not going to get into magic today, but definitely if you want to see me talk about magic, I could definitely make a video about that. But for Wiccans, magic is a big part of their faith. Casting spells is a large part of Wiccan practice and Wiccan ritual. There's different conceptions of it, some of it borrowed from like Aleister Crowley, the occultist, who believed that magic is one imposing their will on nature in a sort of mystical sense. And some Wiccans believe that magic is this unknown force of nature that science has either not figured out yet or is unwilling to look at, that they are playing with. The most common Wiccan spells are for healing, for fertility, to get away bad spirits, the typical things that people would cast spells for. And early Wiccans used to believe in a strong dichotomy between what they did, their fertility magic, their good magic, and they called that white magic, as opposed to curses and evil magic, which they called black magic, which is pretty yikes if you think about it in the modern day. And Wiccans have since tried to back off from this a little bit. Speaking of a little yikes, Wicca used to be pretty hostile to the idea of LGBTQ+ people. as you can guess, with the idea of the duality of gender, that there's one, a binary there, and two, it's rather essentialist of them. A lot of discussion about linking femininity and fertility, which is not exactly the nicest thing to do for people. But then again, Wiccans are fairly progressive, and today you would be very hard pressed to find somebody who is like actively discriminatory against LGBTQ plus people in a Wiccan coven. As for like a Wiccan morality system, there's not a ton. What your personal convictions aren't a huge part of Wicca. There's a concept of, reverence for nature. So there's a lot of environmentalists, especially in the 1970s, who are in Wicca. But on top of that, there is one tiny bit of like a concept of morality within Wicca, which is called the Law of Threes. The idea is that anything that you put out into the world is going to come back to you threefold. This is very similar to more dharmic religious concepts like karma. And their religious symbol is the pentagram, which, you've probably seen because when it's upside down, it's usually the symbol for Satanism. But when it's right side up, it's supposed to represent the 5 essential elements.
Water. Earth. Fire. Air.
And Aether. I don't remember the Avatar mastering either, but whatever. It's supposed to be like spirit. So if it's a religion that has a lot of variability when it comes to what you believe and what you think is right and wrong, then what is it that Wiccans do? Like how do you do Wicca? One of the central concepts of Wicca is that the meeting, the ritual, is extremely important and should be a very captivating religious experience. So what we're going to start to pick up here is that Wicca was developed as a response to Christianity. And many of the central tenets of early Wiccanism is very much a response to things that the founders of the religion saw as issues within Christian society. And rituals, the Wiccan rituals, are meant to combat the idea of Christian rituals and Christian communions, which are very dry, which are very dead, as the Wiccans believed. And so they were more interested in making sure that the rituals were captivating, were entertaining, were spectacular in the sense of the spectacle. I'm sure Michel Foucault is going to be coming to my door any minute now. There's even one Wiccan high priestess who claimed that some people might be skeptical of the paranormal claims of Wicca, but they come because the rituals are so captivating, and that she was perfectly fine with that. Wiccans tend to celebrate important moments in the solar and lunar calendar, so the equinoxes, the solstices, the full moons, the new moons are the typical times when they perform their rituals. What they tend to do is cast spells, which includes all the things you would think, with wands and cauldrons and incense and candles and whatever you can think of that is associated with magical spells, they use. One thing that comes up that's highly sensationalized about Wiccans is skyclad ceremonies, which is when they perform these ceremonies naked. It ranges between beliefs that the clothes contain your magical powers, or that clothes are a representation of differences in social class, and that if everyone's naked, everyone's equal. It also might have to do with the fact that the first Wiccans were members of a country club of nudists, but there is a aspect that is the skyclad ceremony, the naked ceremony. That is a thing, an interesting and neat thing. Another thing that they've been downplaying, especially since the Satanic Panic, watch my Satanic Panic video here, is sexual magic or sex magic. Most covens are run by a priest and a priestess, and some Wiccan rituals involve them doing the do as part of the whole Wiccan coven thing. Again, the response to Christianity, part of this is the destigmatization of sex. When you join a coven, there's an initiation ritual, and there are rituals when you go deeper, when you become a full member, when you become a priest yourself, those kinds of things. There's also a more loose idea of marriage, kind of getting away from the hardcore rules about Christian marriage. There's something that's borrowed from pagan Irish culture, which is when two people get married, they get married for about a year as a sort of trial, and then at the end of said year, they can then decide whether they want to keep this going. And a strong idea that marriage lasts as long as love does, and that falling out of love and splitting up after a marriage is not something to feel guilty about. that, that's life and that's okay. Which sounds like a way healthier approach to relationships than most of us have. Now, Wicca has mutated a lot. As I mentioned, it has a ton of beliefs and multiple different sects, which the Wiccans call traditions. The largest three would be called the British Traditional Wicca, which has the awesome acronym of BTW, which are made up of Algard Wicca, Alexandrian Wicca, and Gardnerian Wicca. And these are the British three. But as I've mentioned, many Wiccans are very personal in their spirituality and their spiritual beliefs. And so this is very diverse, obviously, as you can guess. Wiccans tend to run in very small congregations called covens. According to tradition, the ideal size for a coven is about 13 members, but it can be more or less. Each coven is run by one priest and one priestess, and they typically are closed off to adults. Actually, they're closed up to most people. They don't advertise. You usually have to be invited into the coven. That being said, the majority of Wiccans today don't actually belong to a coven, and they practice their own beliefs privately on their solo. So the next question would be, where did this come from? Where did this movement start? How did it all happen? It comes in the contexts of a lot of interesting movements going on in the Western world, but especially in England. One of the biggest things going on in early anthropology was a now discredited thing called witch cult theory, which is the idea that the oppression of witches and the witch hunts in, the olden days was the result of people hunting down people who were practicing pagan faiths that had somehow survived the Christianization of Europe. One Egyptologist named Margaret Murray wrote the Encyclopedia Britannica article for Witchcraft, which became very influential and seeded a lot of the ideas for what would become Wicca. There was also a lot of interest in occult things, Aleister Crowley being one of the big influences of Wicca. We can talk about Aleister Crowley in a future video. Also, Freemasonry has some inspiration, especially with that mystery aspect to it. Spiritualism, which was very popular in late Victorian England, which is the idea that there are spirits everywhere and that you can communicate with them. Seances were a really big deal in Victorian England. Theosophy, which is like a different sort of mystery occult religion that probably should be a video of its own. Just inspired by the works of folklorists who were studying pre-Christian Europe, as well as the few still remaining what would be called clever folk, people who still practiced folk magic and folk medicine and things like that. And not to mention, Wicca built upon the development of neo-pagan groups, which were trying to take old religions from pre-Christian times and try to rehabilitate them and turn them back into faiths. Like, there was a big new Druid movement in England. So as you can probably guess, Wicca was founded in England. Its founder's name was Gerald Gardner, and according to his claims, he was invited into a witch's coven where he learned a lot of the secrets and the early things about what would become Wicca. He and his wife purchased a nudist country club and started to practice Wicca there with a coven that was mostly made up of former members of the country club. This was all going on in the 1940s. Then in 1951, the British government lifted a ban on witchcraft that had been on the books since 1735, which led to an explosion of books about witchcraft, how to practice witchcraft, what witchcraft was. Despite founding Wicca, Gardner actually never used the term himself. This is actually a name that would be attributed to them later. And then in the 1960s, a whole lot of things happened to the Wiccan movement that you'd think would have made it decline, but actually made it grow further. Gardner himself died in 1964, and the sensationalist press actually made a lot of negative stories about Wiccans. But nevertheless, it grew and started to diversify, and it also started to move to places like Australia and the United States. In the 1970s, it merged with the counterculture, which was, the growing young baby boomers who were turning against traditional society and exploring new forms of spirituality, hence like the New Age movement, as we mentioned earlier. It's also when the cause of environmentalism became deeply ingrained within Wicca. And then in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, a bunch of books came out about how to practice witchcraft on your own and how to practice Wiccan practice without having to join a coven. This led to a lot of individual practitioners of Wicca, and the self-initiates also created a witchcraft craze. If you remember in the 90s, there were a lot of movies and stuff like The Craft, or shows like Charmed, or movies like Hocus Pocus, in which one of the witches rode a vacuum cleaner. Also in the 90s, the internet started to get widespread use, and that really, really helped Wicca grow. Overall, though, I have to say, Wicca's interesting faith. Its belief system is very nebulous, but that kind of makes it unique compared to a lot of the religions of today. And you know me, I'm never a person to yuck someone's yum, especially if they're not hurting anybody, so Wicca, you do you. Sounds good to me. Their beliefs are as valid as anybody else's, and, I feel like them being part of the human tapestry makes it just a little bit more interesting. So, happy Halloween, happy Samhain, etc. Hey everybody, if you are interested in this kind of stuff and this reconstruction of old religions, I definitely recommend my video on the Druids. I should probably make another one that's a little bit more about contemporary Druids, but it's still pretty cool. I also want to draw some attention to this t-shirt. This is the Step Back t-shirt. You can actually get it for yourself at my TeePublic page, which you can go down in the description. Also, if you have some ideas for new t-shirts that I should design, let me know. Lastly, this video would not be possible, and I would not be able to do this as my job if it wasn't for you wonderful patrons on Patreon. This is actually the second time I recorded this video, because the first time I forgot to record, and then I did it, and I did it all over again, because quality is key, and also because Birdie, my moderator on Discord, is my voice of conscience sometimes. Anyways, friends, see you next time. Does anyone else notice how the British spell Halloween and go Halloween?